Hello, and welcome back to my Iliad analysis. In the last episode, we introduced the Iliad, what it's about and what it's not about, what happens and what doesn't, and in this episode, we're going to be delving into detail on themes present within the book at large. To start things off, it's worthy of note that it can be difficult to tell whether something is a deliberate theme, chosen by the author to specifically enhance or bring meaning from the story, or whether it is just a natural consequence of Greek society, with its values and way of life at the time. It could be both, of course, but it's worth looking into the cultural contexts of each of these themes and motifs, as they can reveal far more about what Homer, the author, was trying to say at the time of writing. There are so many aspects of ancient Greek culture that would have been a given to Homer's initial audience, but would go right over the head of a modern reader unfamiliar with such things. The first and most obvious theme is that of war. This is shown primarily through battle itself, the way that the lines of men clash against one another, spears and swords clamouring, striking shields and bronze. But Homer never shies away from depicting war in equal horror and glory. As said in the previous episode, every man who falls in battle is a man, with his own name, family, home, and reasons for being there. I've heard the Iliad described as being anti-war, but the idea of a world without war is still a ridiculous daydream of those most detached from reality even today. To talk about wanting a world without war in ancient Greece would have been unthinkable. Those who do talk about a world without war do so in the context of a mythical golden age, where no one had to farm or be hungry, to work or go thirsty. War, even in the later ancient eras, was seen at worst as an unfortunate necessity, an inevitable product of mortality, like hunger and thirst. Equally, in the original film adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front, the teacher convincing the boys to sign up for war, who is portrayed as misleading them on the reality of combat and wartime heroism, has a quote from the Odyssey written on his blackboard. This is presented as if blaming Homer for romanticising war and convincing the young boys that it is merely some great and fun adventure to be embarked upon, that terrible things will not happen, whitewashing the conflict of all its struggles. To that, I would argue that anyone who comes to that conclusion simply hasn't read or hasn't understood Homer's works. Anyone who reads the passages of young men being butchered and the all-consuming grief of their friends and families, their comrades watching them being cut down, their hopes and dreams that would never be realised, what could have been, now cut short on the end of a spear. Reading and comprehending this will not mislead you as to the reality of war. Homer cannot be described as anti-war or pro-war. He neither cautions against it nor romanticises it. He presents war for what it is, glory and tragedy in all, and allows the reader to make their own conclusion. A modern-day army recruiter might focus more heavily on the glory and the victorious heroes who fight with honour and overcome the insurmountable odds laid out before them, whereas a pacifist would look into the horror and butchery, the trauma and terror that men go through exclusively. Neither of them are truly getting the full picture, or fully appreciating the depth, beauty, and nuance to Homer's writings. An inevitable consequence of covering the reality of war, our second key theme is grief. Far from only depicting soldiers on the battlefield, Homer depicts the wider scope of war and what it does to those who fight it and those who don't. It's not just the effects of constant warfare and time away from family that are depicted, but also the struggles of women and children left behind, unsure as to whether the men they love, who they rely on for protection and income, will ever return. To borrow a phrase, they say that war never changes, and this is, at least on the human side, absolutely true. Technology changes, weapons and tactics change, vehicles and objectives, causes and flags change, but the effect it has on people and families remains much the same. Husbands torn away from their wives and children, their homes, and facing constant deadly danger on a daily basis. fathers having to bury sons, wives and mothers not comprehending, not understanding what would drive a man to go out into the fray and leave them behind. All of this is found in Homer and in modern war. It's no secret that those in older societies were more accustomed to hardship and tragedy, more conditioned to it. But if you were to lose one child, would that make losing a second any easier? Would it hurt less? You might be better able to continue on through the grief, so long as it doesn't break you entirely, but the grief would be just the same. Just because it was more common for our ancient ancestors to suffer terrible tragedies, and their lifestyles gave them no choice but to continue on, this did not make their grief any easier. In fact, look at the mourning practices of ancient peoples. The women claw at their chests, beating their breasts, tearing out their hair and wailing for days on end, often wandering through the streets and doing this publicly. Seeing a woman doing this in the modern day would make you think she had gone completely mad with grief and should be put in a mental institution. The idea that ancient peoples suffered less grief because people died more commonly is simply not true. Even modern anti-war films and books fail to depict these aspects and tragedies of war, something that was already so artfully displayed in its full, raw reality when the Iliad was written in 800 BC. It could be said that grief is the most key theme to the structure of the Iliad. It opens with Achilles, whose very name means grief of the people, something we will no doubt delve into in the future, being outraged, his heart broken by the dishonour put upon him by his leader, before praying to his mother, the goddess Thetis, and praying that the Achaeans suffer defeat after defeat, and that Agamemnon shares his grief with him. His mother, herself weeping, relays his requests to Zeus himself, and it is this prayer, made by a heart full of anguish, that drives the events of the Iliad. Then it's the grief of the death of Patroclus that motivates Achilles to rejoin the battle. The Iliad itself ends when Achilles finally finds a man to share his grief, not Agamemnon as he had prayed, but Priam. The Iliad has several layers of subtext to consider when taking the meaning of Achilles' name to be grief, or grief of the people, as we will cover in a future episode when we delve into the characters themselves. But, just as the name Ares can be read as the god of war himself, come down as a great warrior butchering men, but can also be seen as a metaphorical and spiritual presence of war and violence, Achilles himself can be seen as both the greatest warrior ever born, but also the very presence of the idea of grief, that thing that no one who has ever seen war can truly overcome, personified as the greatest warrior who none can defeat, who even his own allies shirk away from, knowing how fickle he can be. It is his prayers that set the events of the Iliad in motion, thus making grief one of the most integral themes of the poem. In contrast to the grief and horrors of war, our next theme concerns those who embrace such terrors, suffering them, but emerging covered in gore and glory. However, the sense of what heroes truly are is different from our modern conception. Too often does the word hero conjure up a spandex suit or ridiculous, weightless CGI. It also carries with it some expectation of pervading moralism, that being the moral values that are encouraged and mandated by those currently in power, not those of the more timeless variety. Heroes are, in Homer's works, and in the classical sense in general, embodiments of ideas. They are more than mere archetypes, as many describe them today, but men who manifest divine ideas, be that of a people, or a tribe, a nation, or an aspect of a god or goddess. An excellent example is that of Odysseus and Diomedes. Both are favoured by the goddess Athena and express different aspects of said goddess. Odysseus is tactical, smooth and calculating, rational and decisive. He displays more than any other hero in the Iliad courage and wisdom and wit, and oratory skills that can sway the hearts of men. Diomedes, on the other hand, is the swift and skilled warrior, brave and level-headed, honourable and precise, never losing himself in the violence and bloodshed, never overwhelmed by his deeds. We'll talk more about this idea in the coming episodes, which heroes are favoured by which gods and goddesses and why. But for now, this should serve as an example of what a Homeric hero truly is. The heroes of all pagan myth are, however, far from flawless, despite possessing these divine qualities. This, of course, is part of what makes them so compelling. Modern storytelling is so full of characters without flaw or struggle, and they become insufferably boring and unengaging as a result, or so totally, irredeemably evil and degenerate that it's impossible for any sane person to admire them. Both approaches, of either the denial of struggle or the denial of meaning, are just nihilism. To deny that mortal men have flaws, or to deny the fundamental beauty of life and death, is to deny reality, and thus strip a narrative of any emotional impact and immersion. The heroes never strive for perfection, or think of themselves as immortal, unchanging gods. They do not even attempt to be flawless beings because mortals can never attain this. Instead, they strive to live up to their own ultimate potential. It is, then, just as important to learn from the mistakes of heroes as from their successes. Those of us who the Iliad and Odyssey still speak to each have our own desires to accomplish some great feat that will see us remembered, and this can never be achieved without struggle, sacrifice, and thus a great deal of suffering. This has not changed since the dawn of time, and warriors and heroes have forever longed for it, as it is the closest thing we can attain as mortals to immortality. We might not escape the flaws that make us mortal, but we can still chase the greatness that our own potential can grant us, if only we live up to it. In the modern day, a key way in which our innate desire for heroes is subverted is through the tired tropes of superheroes that use bright colours and flashing lights to gain the attention of children, giving them fake heroes to aspire towards being. They do not represent any timeless, divine ideals that men should seek to emulate. Rather, they are merely a combination of hollow archetypes and the mouthpieces through which megacorporations may shape the minds of your children, keeping them away from the eternal and unchanging lessons found in Homer and the heroes he depicts. Unless we ourselves make a conscious effort, we may have been the last generation to grow up surrounded by Greek mythology and European myth in general. Far more children would now be able to tell you all about their favourite superhero than they could about Heracles, Achilles, Perseus, or Odysseus. As a child, I remember finding absolute joy in reading of Theseus and his struggle against the Minotaur. Seeing Jason and the Argonauts do battle with the terrifying Talos on film, as old as the film already was, even when my father was young. Now, however, these brightly coloured, hollow subversions of heroism are far more familiar. I've spoken even with adults who, when they hear the name Thor, far more associate the name with that ungodly anti-cinematic nonsense than with our ancient European heritage. The heroes of the Iliad are not particularly comparable to those of Tolkien either, who has been regarded as somewhat of a modern Homer. Of course, I would never wish to sit here and disparage Tolkien of all writers, but his heroes are, by and large, less nuanced, and a clearly defined good and evil is established. Some readers prefer this, but many, such as myself, prefer the Homeric, morally questionable heroes, as war makes men do morally questionable things for the sake of victory, survival, and revenge. Tolkien, who lost many friends during the First World War, a war for dubious causes and little gain even for the victors, wanted an escape from that reality of war, and wrote for vastly different reasons than Homer. Tolkien has the famous passage, "I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend." Homeric heroes, on the other hand, often fight for the sake of fighting. They seek everlasting fame and immortal glory, and it doesn't bother any of them that the cause for which they fight is dubious at best. Achilles, for example, is said to be heartbroken and depressed that he can no longer join combat, which is his greatest pleasure in life, because to do so would be to aid Agamemnon. Heroes in the modern sense, and this includes Tolkien to some extent, seem purely reactionary. This is, in the case of Tolkien, a product of both his staunchly Christian values and his desire for an unambiguously good cause, wherein cultures who had bitter grievances with one another finally come together and defeat the encroaching forces of darkness, clearly born from his time as an officer during the First World War. However, this reactionary and morally clear-cut nature, in the case of such drivel as superheroes, exists because they are saints of the status quo, and it is their job beyond all others to make sure that nothing in the world is allowed to change. Any moral ambiguity in these superheroes, and all of a sudden the very values of the system are in question. There are very few tales now of brave men setting off into the wider world in order to achieve their own goals, just enforcers of the system and its whims, fighting against vaguely defined evil for the sake of vaguely defined good. Rather, all villains seek to change something, all superheroes seek to stop them, or to change things back to the status quo, and always succeed. The system and its icons cannot be allowed to fail. There are, however, a number of traits that are still associated with heroism today that we might see in the Homeric heroes, but often it is in a vastly different context. Bravery in the face of overwhelming odds is often displayed, but in ways that appear to be expected of them. When a man does not willingly throw himself into the fray, he is chastised, mocked and belittled, taunted by his peers, superiors, and, on occasion, subordinates. Even the conduct of kings, nigh on omnipotent in their rule, can be called into question, and accusations of cowardice can be given without reprimand, if deemed fair. There is also a key willingness to embrace the principle of self-sacrifice. No hero expects his men to go out and do something that he himself would not do. We see this in Sarpedon's speech, in which he tells his comrade Glaucus that their place in the nobility of society means that they must also take their place at the most dangerous part of the fighting fray. Aside from when they are wounded and cannot continue fighting, at no point do we see the heroes sending their men off to fight without them, except, of course, when Achilles sends Patroclus out to lead the Myrmidons in his place. And we all know how that ends up. However, this willingness to embrace self-sacrifice is very different to the kind of nihilistic fatalism and hive-mind mentalities we have seen in, for example, the Soviet Union throwing human waves of German machine guns. One thing you'll often notice throughout the Iliad is that none of the men who resign themselves to a heroic, glorious death in battle do so when there is nothing left to live for. We often hear the women remind them of how much they have to lose, and why they should take themselves away from the fight. It's Mother Thetis in the case of Achilles, Andromache his wife in the case of Hector. But if they had nothing left to lose, they would have no principle to embody, nothing worth dying for. Even a man who has lost all worldly possessions, his family and the life he had known, has revenge to motivate him. And should he fail, it is clear that he still has that to lose. However, the man no longer interested in living for any reason has already been defeated. He serves no higher purpose, but like a dying dog, seeks to be put out of his misery. The heroic man, motivated by ideas and ideals emanating from the divine, makes a conscious choice to reject the instinct of basic survival. This is the mastery of man's lower, animalistic self, doing away with the most powerful mortal drive and embracing the immortal and the divine. To give a more modern example, there's a sense of pity when one looks at the Red Army soldiers being mindlessly herded towards German machine guns. No one looks at them and thinks of a glorious self-sacrifice, but of cattle sent into the meat grinder. Worthless human life being poured into the battlefield in a manner not unlike concrete being poured into shape. There's a helplessness to them, a sense of pointlessness and futility. Compare that to another group famous for their willingness to embrace death and self-sacrifice, the kamikaze. While some might question the effectiveness of their tactics, others might recoil at the idea of doing something similar themselves. No one ever looks at them with any sense of tragic pity. The individual living and dying for an idea embodies the heroic principle. Mindless masses stacking their own bodies to run the enemy dry of ammunition does not. The next theme ties in quite closely to heroism, and that is honour. Honour and glory are the two most highly prized ideas in the minds and lives of heroes, and everything they do is guided by a profound sense of honour and aimed towards increasing their glory and good fame. This was often displayed through vast quantities of wealth, gold and ornaments, beautifully decorated armour, weapons and shields. In the era of the Bronze Age, the near limitless wealth displayed by kings and nobles could only truly be gained through war. Thus, even their pursuit of wealth was not a materialistic one, but simply a manner of displaying their power and prowess. An example of this is when Achilles finally agrees to return to the battlefield in order to avenge Patroclus. Knowing that he will surely die in the battle to come, he still makes a show of accepting Agamemnon's offers of land, gold, ornaments, and his daughter's hand in marriage, as well as the return of his own war bride Briseis. Achilles knows full well that he will not live long enough to make use of, or even see, any of these items and prizes, but rather he accepts them as they add to his glory and honour, and the gift is accepted as recompense. Conquests, trophies, and wealth were not valued for their material bargaining power, but were shining physical symbols and emblems of the great victories the warrior has won, displays of their unquestionable bravery and skill at arms. As we will get into in the next episode, armour plays various symbolic roles throughout the Iliad, and one of them is a trophy. Men do not risk their lives trying to strip a fallen man of his armour so that they can sell it when the war is over, but as undeniable proof that they slew the man in question. It is for this reason that stripping a warrior of his prize, even when outranking him, is seen as a direct insult and attack on the honour of that warrior. It is taking a very symbol of the glory he has won and taking it for yourself. This is why Achilles reacts so viscerally to Agamemnon taking his war bride from him. She was taken as a prize in his victory, and to take her from him is to tell him that his efforts were useless and not worthy of recognition. Standing by and allowing this from one whom Achilles sees as a far lesser man would be weak and dishonourable. As we will cover in a future episode, reducing his wrath and scorn at such dishonour to him throwing some kind of temper tantrum is both ridiculous and emblematic of one who himself doesn't understand honour or even righteous fury. Achilles is faced with a choice that tears at his honour. Either he refuses to fight for Agamemnon, losing his glory in combat and honour as a warrior, but retaining his honour as a man, a prince, and a demigod. Or, in the inverse, he could choose to continue pursuing his glory in combat, but that comes at the price of tolerating Agamemnon's disrespect and diminishing his honour as a man. Both choices offer honour and dishonour, and only the intervention of Athena, divine wisdom incarnate, prevents a bloodbath. Equally, Odysseus is happy to do dishonourable things, resorting to clever trickery and nighttime attacks in order to get home to his beloved wife and son, who he never wanted to leave behind in the first place. He does dishonourable things for an honourable reason, and this too is an interesting introspective considering the standards and the importance of honour, glory, and family at the time. The next theme that we're going to move on to is that of fate and choice, and the relationship and conflict that these two ideas have. Homer depicts fate as something that is ordained, one that a man cannot avoid, but equally there are many opportunities in which a crossroad is presented. Achilles, for example, is told that he has a choice. He can either return home and live a quiet, peaceful life, have a family who loves him, and die in old age a happy man. Or he can choose to pursue a life of battle and glory, strife and pain that will mean his story shall last throughout the ages. The fact that we are still talking about him even today is proof that the gods honoured that promise. In Homeric works, fate is a path, and man must choose to walk it. When the heroes slip, they are often confronted and upbraided by the gods and goddesses, who come to chide them and remind them of either their destiny or their lineage, and the expectations placed upon them, spurring them onward to fulfill their destiny, for better or for worse. Of course, the final fate of all mortals is just that, mortality. All men must die, and great glory and good fame that lasts throughout the ages is the closest thing that a man can achieve to immortality. One who has read the Iliad will notice the absence of promises of some great paradise, of Elysium or the Blessed Isles, no reincarnation or better life after death. Rather, they perform their great deeds with the knowledge that whatever they do, they will die and end up amongst the shades. Glory and honour, then, are preferred to peace and old age. I'm reminded of a passage from the Havamal. The coward believes he will live forever if he holds back in the battle, but in old age he shall have no peace, though spears have spared his limbs. In my own experience, this is the most profound idea held by our ancient ancestors, and something that we in the modern day are, for the most part, ignorant to. Danger and death are not commonplace. Glory is absent. Honour is a novel, childish idea, and the ideal life is one lived as long as possible and shielded from war and risk. But having been under fire from artillery and tanks, it's difficult to describe the realisation that, having survived, you feel as if you've escaped death, only to realise that you've only delayed it. You've escaped death for now. Even if you survive the entirety of the war, you will still die by some other means. Each overwhelming rush of relief and victory, the feeling of having been made invincible by some higher power protecting you, or the fates not having yet cut your thread, is tinged with the sense that you have at best put off that inevitable moment for another day. It's something that I believe you have to have seen death coming for you and narrowly avoided to truly appreciate. On to the next key theme in the Iliad. There is the bond of families. While the bonds of families are still relevant today, the heroes of the Iliad cannot be separated from their families. Each man is the son of someone, descendant of someone. Often the heroes are even referred to as names that make their ancestry clear. The Atreides are the most obvious example. The patronymic that Agamemnon and Menelaus, the sons of Atreus, are referred to as. Achilles is referred to as both Pelides and Iacides, the names of his father Peleus and grandfather Aeacus respectively. Iacides is also used to refer to Ajax the Greater, as well as Achilles, as the two are both grandsons of Aeacus. Ajax, the cousin of Achilles, is sent as one of Agamemnon's messengers in the hopes that his cousin might be able to convince him to rejoin the battle. Likewise, Aeneas, cousin of Hector and Paris, comes to their aid without question, though stands to gain little for himself. Kinship bonds were unshakable, and what we today would refer to as extended family were, to our ancestors, just family. Contrary to the popular conception of Agamemnon using his brother's unfaithful wife eloping with Paris as merely an excuse to take control of the Aegean, this is found nowhere amongst the book. And while he might not be the best king or the greatest warrior on the Achaean side, he does do battle and wage war for the sake of his brothers, and thus his own, honour. And as a heroic king, embodying the very idea of his people's existence, this is an insult to the honour of the Achaeans as a whole, hence the willingness of the rank and file to go to war for the sake of reclaiming Helen. Compare these two brothers to Hector and Paris, one the champion of Troy, the other its ruin. Hector is constantly upbraiding his brother for his disgraceful and cowardly behaviour, even mocking him, as he cannot stand to see his family dishonoured, and as living embodiments of the very idea of the Trojan people, he brings dishonour to his folk too. The book is full of brothers and cousins launching themselves into battle alongside one another, or attempting to rescue or avenge their kinsmen. The honour of one's family was one's own honour, hence sins of the father pass not to the son in Christian doctrine being a somewhat revolutionary statement at the time. A man did not exist outside of his family. Women would often only bear their family name, not a personal one. Chryseis is the daughter of Chryseis, Briseis of Briseis in the Achaeans, and even in the later Roman naming conventions this was still the case. Julia was the name of every woman born to the Julii clan. As Indo-European cultures are patriarchal and patrilineal, men would be given more names inherent to their status as individuals, but even these would typically be ancestral in some way, unless there was some deed great or notable enough for a man to earn his own family branch within the clan. Something else that is a staple of the Iliad is the ancestral poetry exchanges before entering a duel. It was customary for two warriors to size one another up before a duel, like two stags standing off before locking horns and doing battle. One of the ways in which they would do this is by recounting the deeds of their ancestors and their illustrious pedigree, both as an honour to their ancestors and as an intimidation tactic toward the other duelist, demonstrating why he cannot hope to win against a man from a line of such indomitable heroes, kings, and even gods. It also demonstrates the fact that a hero is inseparable from his ancestors. It is as if the deeds of their bloodline are their own, something that they personally took part in, because a man is nothing without his family. He talks of his family's deeds the same way as he does his own, their strength as he does his own. Ancestral poetry is a hallmark of Indo-European warrior society, as it allowed a man to memorize the victories of his ancestors, add his own to them, and then pass them down to their sons, and the cycle repeats. They keep their ancestors' fame and glory immortal, as well as their own, and it may have been these ancestral poems of great deeds and victories that allowed Homer to have enough material of the war to compile into his own works. As an extension of family bonds, the theme of fathers and sons deserves its own, more specific deep dive. It is that relationship that is mirrored in Achilles and Priam, one being a son who will die young and leave his elderly grieving father behind, the other an elderly grieving father who has to watch his son die. At the end of the Iliad, the two men share in that sense of loss, opposite sides of the same oval coin. In the stories following the Iliad, we also see the desperation of Odysseus to return to his son Telemachus, now a young man who he hasn't seen since infancy, and Nestor, the old and wise warrior who sees his son Antilochus slain by Memnon. He finds himself too weak to avenge him, and instead begs Achilles to slay him on his behalf, feeling powerless to slay the man who killed his son, but overwhelmed by the grief and pain of watching his youngest boy butchered upon the battlefield. The final theme that I'd like to cover is that of guest right, called xenia by the Greeks, which is a concept that has been imperative to every Indo-European society. This importance perhaps stemming from necessity, with their tribes having been typically very warlike, semi-nomadic and expansionist. Getting caught in an Eastern European winter is bad enough even today, so the dangers faced by those wandering westward or into the north would have been countless. But that's merely speculation. We've discussed this concept in our first ever episode, An Introduction to Indo-Europeans, but in the context of the Iliad we can give more clear examples of exactly how important this idea of guest right was. First of all, the words guest and host both come from the Indo-European word gosti, which referred to two men who had entered into the host-guest relationship, sealed with an oath, ritual or pact. Traditionally, oaths would call for a specific god or goddess to bear witness to this oath, and in the case of the gosti, this would be the Sky Father, known of course as Zeus to the Greeks. As most probably know, the gods are given different epithets and titles depending on what they are being called upon for, which is common throughout Indo-European cultures due to our shared history of warrior poetry. For example, Odin is called by countless names, such as Gotir, Longbeard, the High One, and, curiously enough in the Icelandic rune poem, War-leading Jupiter. The Romans had Jupiter Tonans, the Thunderer, Mars Gradivus, the Strider, to name a few. The Greeks, of course, are no different, and we'll be going a bit deeper into epithets and their meanings within the context of the Iliad in a future episode. But for now, let's focus on those most relevant to the theme at hand, that of guest right. Zeus is called both Zeus Horkios, keeper of oaths, and Zeus Xenios, protector of guests. Paris is so rightly despised, not simply because he eloped with another man's wife, but he did so while violating the sacred guest right that all honourable men were expected to uphold. And thus he, his kinsmen, brothers, cousins and folk would suffer for this despicable act of oath-breaking treachery. As another example of the severity that Xenia was treated with is that of Glaucus and Diomedes, heroes of Lycia and Argos, respectively. When the two square up to fight one another and begin posturing in the manner of the time, they of course begin to recount the deeds of their illustrious ancestors before the fight can begin. As it turns out, however, the two men are both descended from heroes who were one another's guests, and due to this pact having been made by their respective bloodlines, the two men refuse to fight one another, instead deciding to exchange gifts and part ways as friends, offering to host one another in their own homes once the war is over, as their grandfathers had done. The Pact of Xenia was so strong that it could pass down throughout generations for as long as it could be remembered, and two men on opposite sides of a vicious and brutal, merciless and bloody war, about to duel to the very death, could be so easily persuaded to shake hands and part amicably. This is the pact that Paris is guilty of breaking, and this is why he is so rightly maligned by allies and enemies alike. As said towards the start of the episode, it's difficult to pinpoint what is a deliberate theme being explored by the author and what is a natural consequence of presenting reality as it was in the Homeric era. The bonds of blood were more important than ever, as clans had to be relied upon to come to one another's defence, and the individual warrior, likely to die very young, needed his honour and glory to live on after him, and ensure he was remembered and recounted by his own descendants, not just disappearing into the vague mass of general ancestors. It's an unpleasant thing to confront, but how many people today truly know their ancestors beyond their grandparents or great-grandparents? Not just their names, but their deeds and legacies. And if we're truthful with ourselves, with no disrespect to them intended, how many would be worth recounting in poems or songs? How many have achieved something worth remembering? Very few, and the modern man is inevitably separated from them, forgetting them. But this is not entirely new. It can be argued that a driving force towards glory and good fame was that precise and very real fear of being forgotten. It certainly drives Achilles onto war, despite knowing that he will die in it. We should be honest with ourselves enough to learn the lessons of the Iliad and do something worth remembering. My mind turns slightly to the Northman, when Amleth stands before his enemies and cries, "I am Amleth the Beowulf, son of King Alvendir Warraven." How many of us could stand before our enemies and recount our lineage? How many of our children will be able to do so when we ourselves are gone? Before it's too late, seek glory and good fame. Seek to be remembered as a proud ancestor, or come to terms with the fact that we all must make the choice of Achilles. A life of glory and struggle, often short and wrought with danger, or one that is long and peaceful, full of love, but ultimately forgotten. Until next time.